What a wonderful reception. Thank you so much, everyone, for welcoming myself and Tilda. We're going to have an hour of conversation. We're not quite sure where it's going to go, but it's going to focus mostly on this incredible exhibition that hopefully most of you have seen. If not, you will see very soon. I saw it this afternoon, and of course, I was very moved, very touched, very blown away. It really is a kind of anti-retrospective in the sense that it looks back, but very much to look forward. There's so many new commissioned works, so much re-archiving to look forward. So that was very profound. Obviously, the title Ongoing is all about that. We'll hear more. But what I really saw was so much of the personal Tilda, the Tilda we don't know that much about because we know the public you. But of course, you're letting us into the very personal you through this. And the hand of you as an author, as someone who's not just, I mean, there's a great curatorial team here, of course, that have helped guide you and work with you, but you're very involved in this exhibition. Your hand, your time, your life is interwoven into every element of this show. So I look forward to hearing from you about all of those things. But congratulations to you for this moment. I'd like to start at the beginning. So tell me, how did this idea first come about with the Eye Museum, and what were your initial ideas, and how did they develop to where we are today?
The very first thought was that Sandra, who was the previous director here, made this suggestion, would you like to make a show here? And I can say that very quickly I hesitated. I didn't even really take it seriously. And I know that the reason for that was I had a sort of failure of imagination about what it could be. I had a very instant knee-jerk thought about old stuff, retrospective, old clips of old films, old posters of old films, old costumes on mannequins. I just couldn't feel my own interest in that. And so I demurred, you might say. And then with amazing patience, I kept asking me, and then Breche, who succeeded Sandra, started the conversation again, by which time I had the inkling of an idea, because I wanted to make something that I thought might be useful. I don't know that I could imagine the old retrospective bits and bobs would be useful to anybody. And also, I suppose, to be really accurate, the idea of being singled out has always been really complicated for me, not just because I'm not particularly comfortable, but also because it doesn't feel accurate. So the point at which I started to have the idea of Ongoing was when I realized that I could be accurate. It was an opportunity to actually tell the truth about what work is to me, which is something collective, something about collaboration, and also something that is ongoing. It's not about projects that get dreamed up and achieved and then sent off into the world. It's about these long-standing relationships. And the projects are only ever, my analogy is that the conversation, the relationship is the trunk of the tree.
Yeah.
The particular conversation is the branch, and the film or the project, whatever it is just a leaf. And it comes and it goes. But the most important thing is the relationship. And out of that relationship, year in, year out, decade in, decade out, these conversations grow.
It's amazing because it's so much about process over product. Ongoing, was it always your first idea as the title, or did it come through the process of putting the show together?
There was a short list, but it sort of rose to the top quite fast. And I have to confess, one of the reasons, the sort of final reason that I chose it, was honestly, I thought, this is a beautiful word to have on a poster around Amsterdam at the moment, but the work is going to travel, and I just feel at the moment ongoing is a good thing to see out of the corner of your eye when you're getting on a ferry or a bus, to just see the word ongoing, because we hear and read and, you know, take in so much about endings these days. And it felt like it was one suggestion that I could make. That
Yeah,
might
endings
be
and also
helpful.
fixed positions. And
Fixed
it's
positions.
also not only about endlessness, but it's also about no boundaries and this fluidity that is so much embodied by you and embodied in your work. And I think that ongoing has that kind of feeling of generosity, because it's also about including many people into that conversation that you're having.
Exactly. I mean, it is about evolution. And
Yeah.
and when I
And constant change.
constant change. When I realized that I wanted it to be as personal as it is, I didn't want anything other than something really authentic and personal. And as you say, Jefferson, authored, because it also comes at a time in my life when I'm ready to be the author that I have been avoiding being for so long. I've been playing with being an interpreter, but that's just played out, frankly, for me. This show is a bit of a game changer for me, because it's an opportunity to really embrace the way in which I love to make
But you've always
connections.
had your own artistic practice. You know, the Maybe is a very good example of that, when you slept in the Serpentine Gallery. What year was that again?
1996 originally.
And tell us a little bit about
1995.
that performance.
That was a performance that, and in the exhibition, for those who haven't seen it yet, the box is there with my glasses in it, and a pillow.
And a mattress.
And an absence of me. When 1994, very importantly, I was 33, and I went to 43 funerals. Friends of mine who died of AIDS, including Derek Jarman, who died in the February. And this was, as you can imagine, a real watershed moment for all of us at that time. But for me, not only did I lose my best friend, but I also lost my way of working, because I had only really worked with Derek. I'd made 2 other films, one Friendship's Death with Peter Wallen, and one Orlando with Sally Potter. But apart from that, I was working exclusively with Derek. He was my day job, 9 years of 7 films and various other interventions. And when he went, I was high and dry. I had not developed a practice as a professional. I had no concept of myself as an actor. I was this strange, weird sort of phenomenon that had grown up with him, but I didn't know that this was going to be in any way transferable to any other relationship. And so I thought of a gesture, of a performance that was a hybrid between what I love most about live performance, which is everybody in the same room, where anything can happen, and time being, in charge, and what I love most about film performance, which is where you can have you can go really close and scrutinize every pore in someone's skin, and they're unwatched, very importantly. And I also, to be honest, was so aware that I'd been spending about 18 months sitting beside my friends who were dying, and I longed to present a body that was healthy, that was just asleep. It was going to wake up, and it was going to get up, and it was going to go about its day. So this was the gesture of the Maybe, and originally I was intending to put somebody else in the box, but then I realized that it kind of had to be me. And I lay in the box 8 hours every day for a week at the Serpentine Gallery.
Do you think there's a chance that you might slip into it while you're here in Amsterdam?
Well, here's the interesting thing. I made it in...
Not
I made
for
it
8
again in
hours.
Rome the following year, but I made it in New York at MoMA in 2013, and very sporadically and unannounced, which is the way it's now intended to be. And people keep telling me that I was there last month. So I don't need to go in it at all. People will just see me there.
You know, it's incredible how you keep the memory of Derek so alive in your practice, in your work, in this exhibition. I'd love to talk about that first time that you met Derek, when you knocked on the door of his apartment. What happened?
I had reached the point as a performer in the theatre. I left university. I went to university as a writer and immediately stopped writing, which was borderline traumatic. And I started performing in plays because I fell in with a bunch of people that I loved who happened to be interested in the theatre. And I was in all sorts of plays, directed a couple of plays. And then when I left university, I went on performing in the theatre, but in a very half-hearted way. And I had just got to the point when I was thinking, okay, I am not an actor. I don't want to be an actor. I didn't know what I was going to do with myself, but I was asked to go and meet Derek Jarman. And I went to his flat, also flat 19, interestingly enough.
Wow.
I was living in flat 19, which we've replicated in the exhibition, my own flat 19, but he was in flat 19 in Charing Cross Road. And he opened the door with a camera in front of his face, a video camera. And I went in, and he didn't take it down for, I think we must have talked for about 3 hours. And somewhere there'll be a tape with our pretty banal conversation, but certainly we were engaged with each other. And I never left, effectively. I mean, he cast me in the film. He was casting Caravaggio.
Yeah.
And he needed somebody who looked like Caravaggio's model, and I did fit the bill.
But your relationship is so special, and we see, you know, the opening. You open the show with two pieces by Derek, maybe more than two pieces.
Well, one of the most.
But the first film that we see is you carrying the ladder and walking around. And
Yes.
Was that in Dungeness?
Yes, that was in Dungeness.
Incredible sky behind you.
When I first decided to make new work, and of course I being what it is, they said yes, to make new work rather than to have anything that was already out of a box. The one person who's no longer living with us is Derek, and I was determined to find new work by him too, and I did. The first two screens that we have in the exhibition are new work by Derek, scraps that I found in the archive, Super 8 footage. And the first one is of me with a ladder, which I put on a loop. And the second one is me, round the back, is me in the stones at Dungeness and in a bluebell wood. In a bluebell wood, the day that we found Prospect Cottage, we went to shoot in a bluebell wood, and we went on and found the cottage.
Unbelievable. And then recently you were involved in a campaign to preserve the cottage and not have it sold, but have it remain as in a way a kind of what's the right word?
It's a toolbox.
Right.
It's actually a toolbox. It was going to be sold. The estate needed to sell it, and it always occurred to me that it should be used to be functioning. I mean, it was always meant to be, and it always was a toolbox, and full of work always. I mean, it had very little furniture. It just had boxes. We had futons that we rolled up at night and put in our boxes, and it was all, bare wood and stones and freezing cold, I will say. But it felt absolutely like a battery for the life of artists. And it occurred to me that, the last thing I wanted was for it to be made into any kind of museum, any kind of aspect around it. It needed to be functioning, and it needed to be useful for artists' lives. And we launched this campaign to buy it just as COVID hit, just when lockdown happened in March. I think we made the presentation of this campaign to raise £3.5 million, which is nothing, on something like the 5th of March, and then it all, 2 weeks later, it was all closed down.
I mean, it's amazing you did it, because it is an artwork.
It is an artwork, but it is an experience,
Yeah.
and it's about people living, and so people can go, and not just artists, writers, filmmakers, but also gardeners, philosophers, activists, people who need a rest, can go and apply to have a residency there. And the garden is still sprouting where no one ever thought we would ever grow anything.
Well, it's amazing to see those performances in that very intimate way that you and him worked with a Super 8 camera and just you and very little anyone else, probably
And
no
his
one else
shadow,
around.
no, it's just the two of us,
Yeah.
and his shadow keeps passing across
Yeah.
the frame. So
Wonderful.
he's with us. He's in the
What-
exhibition.
What would you say is are some of the foundational things that Derek taught you or you experienced while working with him that you've kept with you?
Well, he was originally a painter, so he knew what it is to work alone. But he definitely, I think he was even explicit about this, that he made films for the company. He made films for the collective.
Yeah.
And when I say that, I don't just mean to gather together people to boss about and do his bidding. He really did make filmmakers of all of us, and he was surrounded constantly by young ones. I mean, Caravaggio was the first film I made. It was also the first film Sandy Powell made,
Yeah.
a great costume designer who's gone on to make the costumes for Martin Scorsese and various other people. That was her first film. And Simon Fisher Turner, my friend who ended up being his composer, his first job on Caravaggio was to get the extras. He used to go down the East End into all the Greek cafes and pull faces out of the crowd like Pasolini did. But he used to give us responsibility for our work. He would say to Sandy, "Oh, you know what to do. Just go and I just need 15 extras." And she would just go away and find bits of fabric down in Brick Lane and turn it into 15th century costume.
So he was a master collaborator.
What he did,
In a
I
way.
wouldn't say in a way, and this is a great compliment to him as a teacher, he didn't teach us anything. He encouraged things that were in us anyway. And I can speak for myself. I wanted this. I wanted to work in a collective way. I was, needing to work in conversation. And he just let it be. There was the first moment, I remember this being true, was a very specific moment when we were shooting. And I was a shy child who was in front of the camera, 35mm camera, which is a very different thing.
This is for Caravaggio.
For Caravaggio,
Yeah.
very different to being in front of a Super 8 camera, which is kind of like home movie style. But I was being scrutinized by this camera and feeling a little uncomfortable. And I remember saying to him, "Can I look back?" And without a beat, he said, "Yeah, you can look back into the camera," which at that stage was really kind of transgressive. And I take off this. It was to do with my hair coming down. I felt a little scrutinized, and I just wanted to be present for that moment.
Yeah.
And looked into the camera. And of course, that became something quite emblematic for me when I worked with Sally Potter on
Orlando. Yeah, it's a key part of that film. Kind of makes it, grounds that film in a kind of contemporary way, super contemporary way.
But Derek was also an absolute. There were no boundaries to his working practice. As I say, he was a writer, always writer of essays, writer of poems, writer of polemic. He was a gardener. That's very serious. I mean, he wasn't a gardener on the side. The Prospect Cottage, I believe, really is a masterpiece of his work. And as a gardener, he took it very seriously. Some of his writing is about gardening.
So do you feel that similar to you? Do you feel to that?
I felt that was a kinship. I mean, there's a quote that I remember when I first saw La Dolce Vita, Fellini's great film. There's a quote. The character who, in fact, I hate to say it, is the suicide, Steiner, says, I have to remember it now, under pressure. I'm too, what is it? Too serious to be a dilettante and too much of a dabbler to be a professional. And I remember when I read those subtitles thinking, well, yeah, that reminds me of Derek and it reminds me of me, and it's continued to feel true.
Yeah, because also you like to remain teachable. You like to remain open to new experiences. Not be in that place where you feel like you know it all.
Well, I think also, I mean, to just look for a second at the idea of professionalism, we were proudly amateur. I don't just mean in terms of our attitude, and we were not making any money. I mean, I really mean no money at that time. It wasn't about exchange. We weren't trained. We weren't trained filmmakers. I wasn't a trained performer. We were working in a sort of atmosphere of experiment always, and that felt avowedly unprofessional. And it also, in terms of the film context, we didn't really make a dent. You know, we were off to the side and definitely underground. And we loved that. We felt very
But the
proud
hard
of
thing
the
is,
freedom
how
of that.
do you keep that? How do you keep the spirit of that alive as your career progresses and as you do more in the world?
Yeah.
And you get the level of success that you've had. And this exhibition is really about embracing that spirit and recognizing how you've managed to hold on to that and keep that flame alight very much. I want to talk about home. Home is such a big theme in the exhibition. I have this image of you as a young girl writing poetry, looking at the landscape that you're surrounded in Kimogen, your family ancestral home, longing to escape, but probably also feeling like you know these roots are a big part of you and that you know, your family, the landscape is in you. Tell me about that young girl writing poetry in Kimogen. What was she thinking?
It's really true. I was looking to escape. I knew I was going to have to exit the building, you know, at some point. But even then, I was aware that I really wanted to integrate. I wanted to find a way of leaving and coming back as myself. I did feel it's not that exotic. A lot of people of 12, 13, 14, 15 feel like they aren't necessarily in their right skin. And I needed to go away, quite far away, in order to kind of go and find my tribe. And I knew that the world of art was going to nourish me as a social being in the way that where I was brought up didn't. But, and this I really am so happy about, and it's one of the great things about growing older, I have integrated now. I have returned. I'm now living back amongst those trees, but I'm there as myself. It's a very different place now, and I feel I can take myself with me, and that's what that young girl would have loved to think was possible. And I'm patting her on the back now and saying, we made it.
So Achipatpong, or Joey, he came to, so there's the village of Swinton, and then there's the family home, which is called Kimogen. So he came to your family home and he made this beautiful film, kind of looking at you, looking at the ghosts, putting the memories of your ancestors into the film. Tell me about the ghosts in Kimogen. Like, are there ghosts? Who are the ghosts?
I mean, there are ghosts
What kind
everywhere,
of ghost stories? What kind of ghost stories are there from your family home?
Do you know, there don't even need to be ghost stories there, because we have this very particular thing of having paintings of people who look pretty much exactly like me, just with a variety of sizes of moustache, all over the place, and evidence of people having lived there in very similar ways. It's the kind of place where, you know, you live a certain way there. You're in rural Scotland, you're surrounded by trees, things go very slow. And I know, because I've read the diaries of my ancestresses, you know, that life is pretty similar to what it was 100, 200 years ago. The internet still doesn't work. It's a beautiful kind of free space. So the ghosts are absolutely practical company there. And yeah, they're absolutely with me always.
And you have this tradition of planting trees. So did Joey plant a tree?
No, well, I have this. My parents, I told Jefferson this when he came, that my parents always had a visitor's book, which I found incredibly oppressive. People, when they were leaving in the morning, when they'd been staying, my father would say, "Right, don't forget to write in the visitor's book." And it was always incredibly... And people forgot, and then they were rung up afterwards and asked to send it all this. So I got rid of the visitors book, and I've decided that everybody who stays there, we're going to plant a tree for. But we haven't planted them yet, but you're going to have a tree very soon.
Oh, wonderful.
And
Thank
your
you.
wife and your son also.
Home. Let's continue
Yes.
on with home and Kimogen because it's such a big theme. So Tim Walker
Yes.
and you, the amazing photographer with whom you've collaborated on some incredible, iconic stories for fashion magazines. This work is very different because it's you wearing the clothes of your ancestors and then sort of in a way interpreting their personalities. Tell us a bit more about what you and Tim were doing to make those extraordinary images.
Well, as I say, I was brought up surrounded by portraits, and I have a great love of and respect for portraits as a result, because I think they're just this, just as I'm always saying, there's no such thing as an old film. There's no such thing as an old portrait, especially if you know it's a good portrait, you know somebody looked like that. You can, it doesn't have to be Rembrandt. It helps if it is, but it can be Sargent or it can be Sickert. This sense of presence, absolute defiance of time, which is what I've always loved about portraits. And I believe that Tim Walker is a great portrait photographer. And I asked him a few years ago to come and make a portfolio of me incarnating a variety of forebears and dressing myself up as my father and my grandfather and my great-grandmother, who was a great singer in the early part of the 20th century. And then for the portfolio here, we twisted it slightly so that I'm wearing my clothes with my ancestors' clothes. So we're defying time one extra kind of twist.
Yeah.
So, for example, there's a portrait in there of me dressed as my grandfather, ready to go to the First World War in a original First World War tin helmet. But he's got a Second World War but gas mask beside him. And I'm wearing what looks like an army issue Macintosh, but it's actually Chanel. And we keep twisting this, and particularly in relation to my great love of uniform and the way in which my father's and grandfather's uniforms were very instrumental in giving me a love of clothes, much more than my mother's silk dresses.
Yeah.
It was my father's uniform. So we work with them as well.
Can you introduce us to one of your craziest ancestors?
Craziest? Oh, Lord.
Almost, exotic.
There are, but I was brought up to believe that my family were all soldiers. It was a sort of story that they told me, but of course it was nonsense, and there were lots of artists. They kept that from me. I think they were trying to snuff me. But I've realized since my beloved parents left us that actually there are lots of artists in my family. We had one of my ancestors invented the tank.
What?
But another one invented the television.
What?
He had a very ambitious and self-publicizing student called John Logie Baird, who actually gets the credit. He gets the credit. But there's a whole movement in Edinburgh to get Alan Campbell Swinton
to be recognised.
Yeah,
for inventing
the cathode ray.
The cathode ray, brilliant,
yeah.
Amazing.
So kind of screen and war. These are the sort of family lines.
Now, in your performance, you had a performance here last night, the night before.
The night before, we did 5 performances
with Olivier Sayard.
Okay,
so tell us a bit. So Olivier Sayard's a famous fashion historian. He's also an amazing fashion archivist.
Yes.
And you have been working on a project which started as the Impossible Wardrobe and has had many iterations, but where you work with, in a performative way, different pieces of historical costume or fashion or clothing. But in this this performance echoes what you were doing with Tim. So there's
Yeah.
a kind of conversation between Tim Walker's shoot and what you were doing with Olivia. But you narrate. So you really are storytelling for an hour and a half about some of these different pieces. It'd be wonderful if you could give us a kind of, 2-minute snippet of, go back a couple of nights,
Yeah.
think of one of these pieces of clothing and tell us a little story about it.
I'll give you a précis of the sort of point of the piece. It's called a biographical wardrobe. And for those of you who didn't see it, I actually was just looking. There's a little snippet of a film. It was filmed, and there's going to be a film showing the entire performance in the next few
Great.
days. They haven't put it together yet. There's a little 15-minute sort of smorgasbord right now. But it's about my relationship to clothes and to identity, really. And it starts with the idea, or rather the fact, of me being dressed by other people, being dressed by my beloved mother, and the way in which she tried to make a lady of me and dress me as a girl. And I was very much dressed in my brother's hand-me-downs for the first part of my life. And then, as I've already mentioned, my complete attachment to my father's uniforms and my interest in that whole way of wearing things whereby you are representing something other than yourself in a public sphere, so that you feel safe in some kind of, company, actually. And so we trace this whole development of my capacity to dress myself and to choose my own world of clothes and to choose my own safety and to choose my own expression. And by the by, we draw all sorts of, strands of web back to my parents, back to my grandfather, my grandmother, my great-grandmother. So it's about the apple not falling far from the tree.
But it did, in one sense, fall quite far.
Well, it bounced. It fell, it bounced, and it's
bounced
back amongst the trees.
Home is also central to the work of the recreation of your apartment, the Apartment 19 with Joanna Hogg. And it's an incredible piece because you walk into this recreation of an apartment and what we hear are stories, memories. And I heard a beautiful story about you trying to sneak into the BFI. Tell us that story.
That's a story. We created my first flat. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But we wanted to make stories from the particular rooms. And the first door on the left is the bathroom. And I was trying to remember a story from that room. And the one story I could remember was me lying there seriously considering. We were making Friendship's Death, 1986. It was the second film I'd ever made. And it was the first film in which I was really in every scene and a protagonist. And I lay in this bath, kind of constantly topping it up with hot water, trying to figure out how I could break into the BFI, we were making the film, to steal the rushes, to destroy them, because I knew for sure that the film was going to be a disaster. And I was seriously figuring it out. I was sort of going, well, if I go to Rathbone Place and I go down the back, maybe if I leave it late, and then I actually knew one of the guys who was one of the watchmen there, and I could chat him up and just sneak in the back. And then I slowly talked myself out of it. But yeah, that was real.
I felt the despair when I was listening to the story. But
I'm very glad I didn't. We showed that film here in this very room
great.
last night, and it's a mini masterpiece. I'm very happy that I didn't do it. But
so
it
tell
was
us
real.
more about how you and Joanna conceived Apartment 19 and the story about it.
We started originally, we thought of a little film we wanted to make, which I hope we do make at some point. But a few weeks into that discussion, we suddenly had this idea of making my flat. which was extraordinarily ambitious because this is actually a film museum, and to say to these extraordinary people who put together these exhibitions, it's not just going to be some screens, it's going to be building a West of London flat, and for them to just take it on the chin and say, yeah, let's go, was quite something. But here's the amazing thing. I had no photographs of that flat. It was all from my memory. And Joanna and I had made films before that had drawn on her flat, actually, in the souvenir films. The flat in that those films is her flat, just on the other side of West London. But she'd had photographs of that flat. But this time, it was all about memory. And I have to tell you, when I walked into it for the first time, because even though I'd been, working out all the details and sending, for months she's been ringing me up and saying, so what colour are the walls? Can you send me anything that sort of colour? And I was walking around my house looking for anything that was that colour, and I found a shot glass that was sort of that weird, sort of peachy, pinky thing, and I took a photograph of it. So all of these details have been going on for months. But we had this agreement that I wasn't going to step into it until it was finished. And I stepped into it about 10 days ago, and it was quite extraordinary because I lived in that flat for 14 years, and I thought I'd never go back. And I went back that day. And I sort of think that if
more memories come to you?
Yes, I actually realized I made 2 mistakes in my memories by walking around. But I'll give you a small example. We were looking at the lock of the door, and of course I had no photographs of it. And Joanna sent me a photograph of, a handle on the inside of the door, a handle at the front door. And I went, no, it wasn't like that. I started doing this with my hand. No, it wasn't like that. And then my hand remembered that I went like that. So then we managed to source this ancient lock that nobody makes anymore, and there it is.
Amazing. I mean, it's incredible that the museum managed to recreate it with such specificity.
Yeah, but the significance of that apartment is it's a chrysalis. I went into that apartment just after university, having no working practice, not clear what I was going to make of my life, completely obsessed with film, but not knowing how to find it in 1984. And during my time there, I met Derek Jarman, worked with him for 9 years. He died. I had twins, and when I had my twins, I left in 1998. But it really is a chrysalis, and I believe and hope that when people go around it, they'll remember their flat, their chrysalis, whether it's a student flat or the first place you live in when you're newly an adult and just beginning to kind of feel your identity between finger and thumb and just sensing what you might be, all potential and nothing to show for it. That's a moment that I think we all can relate to, and to have it there. And the other thing
that
that's
feels
really,
like the kind of the main point of the show, really.
Well, it is. It's about being a young person, the show.
Yeah.
It really is. We start with this very young footage. And of course, one of the things that's wonderful, the last section of Derek Jarman we see is The Last of England. And the music comes over when you're in the flat. And of course, when we were shooting that footage, I was going to sleep in flat 19. So it's absolutely appropriate that music should be swirling around that atmosphere. And I also believe that it's one of the most cinematic gestures we could have made, because it's all about atmosphere.
The flat.
The flat.
Yeah, very much so. I'm amazed that you didn't catch your wedding dress on fire when you were making that.
Yeah, no health and safety in those days.
Jim, you were talking about hand gestures earlier, and there is some incredible hand gestures in the film that you made with Jim, where The Dead Don't Die, where you're sort of playing with so you're very professionally maneuvering with a sword, which you cut off a couple of zombies' heads with, more than a couple. But then you do this gesture where you kind of lick the blade with your thumb. It looked pretty dangerous. Where did you get that?
I was taught over a blissful few weeks to operate a samurai sword.
By a samurai master?
By a samurai master in upstate New York. And it was really a beautiful experience, I must say. I strongly recommend it. It's a form of, it's beyond Tai Chi because of that danger. It's super, super perilous. And that precision, it's very, very elegant, obviously, but super robust. And I loved doing it.
Do you have one at home?
No.
Did you enjoy cutting off zombies' heads?
I did. I loved.
It must have been
I
fun.
loved it. And the wonderful thing about making films is that Jim Jarmusch says to you, when you cut off their heads, I can tell you, grey dust is going to come out of their necks, and you believe it, and then there it is, months later.
Keep
Forever.
going. You have such a great relationship with him. I mean, you made so many great films, Broken Flowers, Limits of Control, Only Lovers Left Alive, The Dead Don't Die. Describe what is the magic of working with Jim Jarmusch?
Well, you know, Jefferson, there are two major miracles. One is that I met Derek Jarman and became capable of working in film in the first place. And the other is that I met anybody else after he died that I could work in a similarly nourishing way. And Jim is one of those homes that I found. He works in a different but similarly divine way. He is originally a musician. So there's that change of tone in working with him. But still, he works in a kind of collaborative, collective way. And you jam with him. When we made the Only Lovers Left Alive, in particular, because that film is about vampires. And so it's all shot at night in Detroit and Tangier.
Yeah.
It's a pretty fabulous summer that was. But we shot at night, and he's a very nocturnal individual anyway. And we would sort of get up in the afternoon and go to work and work through the night and just jam. He would write a screenplay that's quite precise, but he's not precious about it at all. And we would just, it was like working with musicians, working with him.
Amazing. That's so wonderful. And Luca Guadagnino, has he been to Swinton, to Kimmage?
He has.
But you decided to make a film elsewhere.
Yes, that's his home.
Okay.
I went to him.
Okay, wonderful.
In Italy.
Now, it's quite a simple portrait in a way, but it sort of says everything as well, in the sense that he's following you, you're running in front of him through the landscape, following you from behind, and at the last minute, you turn around and look at the camera. But it gives you that feeling that we're following you when we're watching that film, that we could be with you in that landscape. So he's sort of playing with this idea of breaking the public you and introducing us to the private you. And you're wearing in that a red T-shirt, a red sweatshirt, which a Raf Simons sweatshirt, which was the same sweatshirt you wore when you first met him.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
So when did you first meet him, and how did that relationship begin?
I
what was
met
the
him.
origin?
Everything seemingly has a connection. Derek died in '94 in February, and in the spring of that year, there was a Jarman symposium at the Palazzo delle Esposizioni in Rome, and I was there. And I met this young man in the foyer. I was actually talking to a diplomat, and it was going on rather a long time. And I thought this nice young man standing at my elbow was going to get bored and move off, but he didn't, and he didn't, and he didn't. And eventually, the diplomat sort of had done his worst, and Luca was still there, and he introduced himself, and he did this brilliant Luca thing. He had sent me a letter. In the days before email, he'd sent me a letter months before asking me to provide the voiceover to a short film of the Penny Peep Show arcade, William Burroughs, that he wanted to make. He was a film student at the time. And I had never answered the letter. I'd read it and left it on the floor and in the flat. One thing that's missing in the flat is we had very little furniture, but there were lots of papers on the floor. And so that was unanswered. And he said this, I wrote to you once and asked you, and I said, oh, that's terrible, I'm so sorry, I do apologize for not replying. How was the film? And then he did this brilliant Guadagnino thing. He said, oh, well, I couldn't make it because you didn't reply.
It's still there.
So I was hooked, and we became very close friends. And in fact, it's emblematic. That tale is emblematic of Lucas and my relationship. It's very, very much about us talking about ongoing projects for decades. At any one time, we have at least 5 projects that I don't know if we'll ever make them, but we've been talking about them for 20 years. And then we might. But those chewing the cud, those long, long conversations, that's Luca and me. We can't get enough of those long, long conversations.
What would you say has been one of those films that took the longest for you to get made, to get distributed, from starting the conversation to the end?
Well, the first long one that I made with Luca was 12 years, was Io sono l'amore. But that was the first one when I realized you must never mind if something's pushed, because an extra year, use it. Someone will suddenly be old enough to play a part, or you'll find a location that otherwise wasn't available, or you'll suddenly work out how to, shoot something that you didn't know last year. And when you start shooting, you're never going to regret any moment of preparation. I mean, preparation is divine. But I will say that Apichatpong and I talked about Memoria for 17 years.
Wow.
That came out of that 17-year conversation, actually. There were parts of our lives that we folded into the scenario of that film. For example...
Did he always know at the beginning that he wanted to make a film that wasn't set in Thailand?
Yes. Well,
did that come later?
The first thing was we wanted to make a film together. And the second thing was we wanted to make a film about an alien. And then the third thing was, not Thailand. That was very clear. Both of us had this, not Thailand, because we just didn't want any kind of grafting,
What do you mean?
There's a sort of slightly dishonorable tradition of people, of white people being shot in places that they don't belong to, and it feeling a little grafted on.
Okay.
And we didn't want to do that in Thailand. But by the same token, we also didn't want to shoot that film in Scotland, because I would have been at an advantage and known Scotland. So we decided to go somewhere that neither of us knew.
Which was?
Which was Colombia.
Yeah.
And there was a resonance in Colombia that we recognized. And so we slowly pieced these things together.
And you'd been to Colombia before?
We both went for this wonderful film festival, the Cartagena Film Festival. And that's when we knew that it was Colombia.
Yeah.
And had this beautiful young Colombian crew. But things were happening. I'd been looking after
There's a kind of
parents.
magic realism in Colombia that echoes the magic realism in
Exactly.
Thailand.
I mean,
maybe.
it's the home of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I mean, it's
close to it.
people sit down to have dinner with their dead great-grandparents all the time.
Yeah.
And it's very easy for us to imagine living there. Yeah.
It's so great.
But the longest, I want to answer this. This is my final question about long gestations. My friend Cynthia Beat and I started talking about a film in 1986, and we finished it last year.
My
a film we
goodness.
made in Fiji.
Tell us more about it.
Well, it's just finished.
Tell us more about it.
It's about Fiji. It's about her
What are you playing?
relationship. It's not a fiction film. It's
Okay.
a sort of essay film about her experience growing up as a colonial child in Fiji and feeling that she belongs to the place, but clearly not belonging to the place. And it's a sort of, it's a very poetic journey to Fiji. And at some point, we'll see it, but it's only just finished now.
There's a couple more things in the exhibition that we need to talk about before we hand over to the audience. But Pedro Almodovar, we haven't talked about Pedro Almodovar. Yeah. So tell us everything we need to know about what it's like to hang out with Pedro Almodovar. Like,
I mean, he was one of the first filmmakers that I remember seeing in, I think, Women on the Verge of Nervous Breakdown is 86, 85, and I remember seeing it in the great Lumiere Cinema in St. Martin's Lane, now a hotel, like all
sadly.
great, not all great cinemas, but a lot of them. And I remember being very, very struck by the familiarity of his milieu And Derek and I were really admiring of him, and we saw him as a sort of Spanish cousin.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But he was doing something very different. He was absolutely unmarginal, in the skirting boards. You know, and he was La Movida. He was Pedro, and he was absolutely drawing on the world in which he lived, clearly, and the sensibilities. But he was also drawing on a tradition of filmmaking that we weren't. He was drawing on melodrama and television and telenovela. He was working with a kind of palette that we weren't, and we were very impressed by it and gone on being impressed by him. He is really phenomenal. When you think of what he's created in the world of culture, it's absolutely unique.
Yeah.
It never really fails, in my view. And I met him a little bit on and off in a shy way, and
At film festivals and things like that.
yeah, I had a moment when the first time I remember catching his eye was at a Hollywood party of all things.
Tell us more.
Real, like, Hollywood party, like a South Park scene with, you know, Liza Minnelli over there and Brad Pitt over there. And I was sort of taking a break from pretending, you know, the effort of pretending you're not impressed at events like that. It's exhausting. So I was sort of taking a bit of a break and standing at the outside of the ring. And I looked to my right, and Pedro was doing exactly the same thing. And we both kind of, you know, acknowledged with a glance that we were, you know, both feeling a bit overawed. But we didn't speak for another couple of years. And when we did, I had the nerve to say to him, listen, I don't have any Spanish, but I'd learn it for you, or cast me as a mute. And then in COVID, he wrote to me and asked me to make The Human Voice.
Yes.
Which was, for two reasons, astonishing. First of all, that he was going to be making anything in English. And secondly, it was COVID, and nobody was shooting anything. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to include this film, The Human Voice, in the exhibition. Not just because it is a complete piece of work, which is handily 30 minutes long, and it's just me and a dog, but also because it's an emblem of something. We made it at a time, July 2020, if you can cast your minds back. At that time, we all thought cinema was completely dead. We thought not only were we never going to be able to come into a room like this and sit in front of a screen like this ever again, or for years, but we never thought people could shoot. And we gathered in Madrid, all heavily masked up, for 9 days, and we shot this little film super fast. And Pedro, whose English was so much less fluent than it is now, just threw himself out the window and directed me in English in some weird, I don't know, the language that we really spoke together was cinema. Sort of sometimes when he ran out of English, I would sort of say to him, no, hang on, well, what are we dealing with? Are we dealing with Now Voyager, or are we dealing with Dark Victory? And that was where we got there. We would sort of get to that emotion.
Amazing.
Because he does work in that language, the language, particularly in terms of, and this is one of the exciting things for me about working with him, the way he films women is very exotic to me, because I have to be a proper woman. My mother would be very pleased. I end up being a lady in a silk dressing gown, you know, and with lipstick on. You know, he actually is interested in the trope of the cinematic woman. And in The Human Voice, it's particular because she's, of course, a wreck. She's someone who is falling apart. And I love the film. I think it's a little nugget. And so to have it at the end of our exhibition in a little cinema was very meaningful.
And in a way, that idea continues in A Room Next Door, because she's falling apart, but at the same time, she's projecting the opposite, which is she's holding it together while she's falling apart, while her health is falling apart.
Yes, and at the same time, there's one of the things that's particular about The Human Voice is that I would say that it's an example of very little of me in it. There's very little of me in that film. I'm there in the shoes of a Pedro Almodovar woman, dressed to look like a Pedro Almodovar woman, and I'm absolutely following the score as laid down by him, and that is the way he works. He's like Hitchcock in that sense. But the Room Next Door was different because we knew each other by then, and we'd had many conversations about our lives and about particularly mortality and our shared visions of what mortality might mean to us. And so I'm closer to my own rhythms and impulses in that film.
Yeah, there's more of you in it. Yeah, very much. I had the privilege of coming to on set while you were filming that in New York at the Rizzoli bookstore, which is the opening scene in the film. And it was just extraordinary how quickly he finished, edited, and got that film into a film festival. It was like a matter of months.
He's a complete machine. He's a machine. We shot.
Does that mean he kind of? Is it because he kind of has the film already in his head so clearly?
It's partly that, and it's also the fact that he doesn't sleep. He shoots.
And is it
in
like
the day,
1, 2
and he
takes?
Edits, 1 or 2. You're
Right.
lucky if you get a third. You have to beg for a third. he does this thing, which again is for me quite, a departure, because having come through the exhibition, so many sort of collaborative. I feel that the most of the exhibition is in the kitchen, or the where we're in the greengrocers or the garden. We're getting the produce and we're sort of making stuff. It's all about making and process. But the human voice is an example of the way Pedro works. It's absolutely complete. He comes to the set knowing what the scene you're about to shoot is like in the film that he's already seen in his head.
Yeah.
And he has to literally pull it out his ear and explain to you what you're going to do, where you're going to sit, how you're going to sit, which hand you're going to hold the microphone, what you're going to do with your elbow. And then the task is for you to translate that into something that feels living. And he does that with all his departments, with his designers and with his camera. He's seen it before.
Yeah.
And that's really remarkable.
Yeah, amazing. There's a couple more pieces left to talk about in the exhibition. One is an amazing painting of your eye with a sort of reflection in your iris of a place called Colonsay. Tell us a bit about this painting. I mean, it's the eye in the Eye Museum. It's your eye in the Eye Museum. But tell us a bit more about the painting painted by Sandro, your wonderful partner.
Sandro is not only my sweetheart, but a great painter who, in particular, in the last few years, has been painting beautiful little hyper-realistic eyes of our friends and loved ones on little sort of golden boxes. And there's always a reflection in them of him, because he's the one who's looking, and there's usually a little light source behind him. And this piece here, I asked him to make this for this exhibition, and this is the biggest eye he's done to date. And the reflection in this eye is actually from Colonsay, which is an island off the west coast of Scotland, which is my favourite place on earth. And for any of you who know my favourite film of all time, which is I Know Where I'm Going by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, it's that island. But it looks onto the Isle of Jura, which is, by the way, where George Orwell wrote 1984. And those hills are the Paps of Jura. And it is one of my favourite things to look at. I mean, wheel me there when I'm 116 and I'll croak looking at that sky. And I love that it's in the show, not only because it's him and because it's a beautiful thing, but because it's looking into the cinema, it's looking at the screen, at Pedro's film. And we call it A Bright Horizon, and that's very apposite. And it's a note to finish on that I'm really happy about.
And then just beyond that is the final sign-off of the show, which is your notes for radical living. So tell us about these notes and how they came about. And it's a sort of manifesto now, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's some notes that I wrote. I was asked to make some suggestions. I think I was asked for a paragraph or something, but I actually ended up writing this. It's like a recipe that occurred to me, might be useful, might give some kind of spirit and connection to people in the last couple of years. And I've actually added a few as the months go by. I add a couple. The Bertolt Brecht always said that he wanted written on his gravestone, he made suggestions. And I think making suggestions is possibly all we should aim ourselves at. I mean, that's enough. And these are my suggestions.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I mean, the show really is so much about creative process, but it's also so much about generosity. And like you said, making an exhibition that can really tell stories, but also can be useful is something that really comes across so powerfully in this.
That's what I really hope. And, one can't control or even really have too many dreams about what people will make of it. But I have a fantasy that at least one person of any age who might have a sort of impulse to make work comes out of this show saying, oh, it's really simple. I can do that. Then I'll really be happy, and I live in hope that that will be the case.
We're nearly out of time, but one final question. Who are some of the collaborators who you wished were in the exhibition but aren't?
Well, there's a long list of people who couldn't be, but I hope as ongoing goes on around the globe, they might join in. There were a handful of people who were shooting feature films and couldn't join in this time round, but I look forward to them popping up. Bong Joon-ho was shooting a film and couldn't contribute. Wes Anderson also is looking forward to next time. So we'll keep. It's a rolling stone that is gathering moss, I hope.
Thank you so much, Tilda. You've been so amazing to talk to. Thanks so much for your time. We are going to open up to questions from the audience. So I'm not sure who's in control of that part of it.
Hi, my name is Bernal. Thank you so much for the talk. It's really inspiring to hear you talk about how you work. I have two questions that kind of relate to each other. The first question is about collaboration. You already talked about it a bit tonight, and I was wondering how to build that tree with the filmmakers you work. Besides, for example, the conversations you had over years with Luca, how do you build that tree? And the second question is about the spirit of DIY experimentation. Our creative outlet is making a zine. It's a queer zine about basically a diary of our queer lives. And for the first issue, we went to Derek Jarman's Prospect Cottage, and we read his book, Modern Nature, and it was very touching and inspiring for us. We were wondering if you would maybe like to make a little contribution to our zine, if it's just a few words. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
That's the way to do it. Yes. It would be my honor. Well, it doesn't matter if it's a zine or a feature film or a garden or a party. You want to be with people that you can be yourself with and that you trust to accept you. And we all know what it is to be around people that we just don't have that vibration with. I find it very touching. I have, a sort of sideline. I work with Chanel as their global ambassador for arts and culture. And Chanel is so much more than handbags and fragrance. Chanel is a huge, huge patron of the arts globally. And we go around the world talking to young artists and students, art students and directing students. And every time I go, I ask, what does this particular territory need to hear? What is the particular issues for people in Sydney or people in Beijing or people in Taipei or wherever it is that I'm going? And recently, in the last couple of years, I've noticed that it's the same thing. It's, first of all, social anxiety. And secondly, for these emerging artists, this sense of the need to be solo, the need to cut themselves off from the people who they felt safe with in putting out their first album, their first film, their first zine, their first collection. This moment comes of a little bit of profile, a little bit of kind of identity recognition, and wherever it comes from, there's a pressure to brand oneself as a solo artiste and to cut yourself off from your collective. And this was in my mind when I had the first idea of making Ongoing. I thought, I've been going around the world saying, it's not true. I'm the poster child for doing it this way for 40 years. You don't have to identify yourself as, you don't have to leave the band. And you can work with many bands, and you can just keep that vibe going. I do think it's a current crisis of confidence that we need to really push back against. And this is my attempt to infiltrate confidence in the collective way of working. You know, because you're making a zine. I mean, you can't do it alone. You don't want to do it alone. You want to do it with your friends. And that will translate into whatever else you do. You just have to value it and not grow out of it. And don't believe you have to grow out of it. I think people are encouraged to believe somehow. I suppose the market wants to organize people and control them in a way. And it's just not true. It's because then you cut yourself off from your own impulses and a sense of trust. And then you start looking for an identity that's not authentic. We want you. We want what you do, only you. We don't want what your version of what somebody else might do. And I think that's what we have to really hold on to. So I'm very excited about your zine. Keep going. I don't know if that answered your question.
Okay.
Yes. Can we meet you after the show?
Sure. Sure. This is how you do it. That's it. It's called connection.
Okay. Hi, Mr. Swinton. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. It's a great honor to ask you because I come here from Japan just to meet you. So it's very artificial. And I think your greatest talent, one of the greatest talent, is to choose collaborators like David Bowie. So I'd like to ask you, what is your criteria or ideas to choose a new choice of relationship? Thank you.
Well, I'm greatly blessed to have extraordinary people come towards me, as David Bowie did in the street once in the 80s. It is really a blessing. But I would say one thing that everybody that I work alongside has in common is curiosity. They're all really curious people, and people who want to find stuff out that they don't know. People who are happy not knowing stuff, and happy happy to receive other people's perspectives. That's also really important, and rarer than one would like, actually. Again, I think it's related to what I answered just now. There's a way of industrial work encouraging people to, first of all, you have to know all the time. You can't ever not know. And you have to know best. And you mustn't ask. And you mustn't accept that maybe you were wrong and you might get a better idea down the line as long as you get into a conversation with someone. I think this is the thing that I'm blessed to find in my collaborators, and that's what I'm always looking for. There's a filmmaker who I'm going to start working with next year, who, well, I've started working with him already, but we're going to make our first film together. And so I can attest, he's a new person in my life, but he's got that. And I notice that that's my litmus test. He has that, it's playfulness. It's about, let's see. We don't quite know what this film's going to be, but let's see. I'm a little, I back away if someone says, I'll tell you exactly how it's going to be. It's going to be exactly like that. The one exception, of course, is Pedro Almodovar. But there's a reason, there's a reason to walk in there. And also, it's still, it gives me a thrill that I'm in there. It's like walking into a kind of, cosplay. But in general, I think finding people who don't know best is a really good place to start. Thank you for coming all the way.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much for organizing this. Also, do you have any suggestions for artists who, once you become a full-time artist, it is really easy to lose the beginner's mindset because there's money involved, there's pressure, there's people. Do you have any suggestions how to keep the beginner's mindset? And attached to that, do you also have any suggestions how to fight the feeling of discontentment when you are creating something?
Wow,
Thank you.
Great 2 questions. It's funny, and this is something that we share. There's something that those of us who started our working practice in the second half of the 80s and the 90s that we have, which is a strange advantage. We never had any money. And we never ever dreamed that we would have money or make any money. It just wasn't an issue for us. And nobody thought that they could make any money out of us, which was also a great advantage. I do have a kind of nostalgia for that time. Mind you, it was a very different time. We were all on the dole. We actually were able to keep body and soul together. But isn't that true that at that time it was a completely different... The way in which we made work was very much for each other. I mean, I was in London in the 80s. People were, putting their looks together to go to Taboo or Heaven on a Saturday night, and whether it was Lee Bowery or Trojan, and nobody even took a photograph. These photographs that are emerging now are few and far between. People didn't even take cameras into those clubs. And nobody had a Pepsi sponsorship, or nobody had an Instagram account.
Yeah.
It was all for then. It was for us there and then. That's a whole different kind of existential relationship to the work, because it's experiential. So this is a very long way of answering. If you could tap into that, I know it's very arcane, but that vibe where you're making the work for you and your pals and your audience, because you have to know that it exists. You have to know that there are people who are going to want what you're making. And try not to think about the money, if possible, or at least... if you're going to make some money, make it with your left hand. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I'm right-handed, so it works for me. If you're left-handed, make it with your right hand. Don't let it push you out of shape. And try and keep your relationship with the work money-free and purely adventurous for you. That's what I would suggest. It's always an adventure for me, because I have to confess to you, there's a strange thing I notice. I've been working for 40 years, and I never intended to be an actor. I hate calling myself an actor, and it's all a bit of a red herring and sideshow, really. But maybe that's been useful to me, because I've never really not taken it that seriously, but I've never aimed at anything. It's always been what comes up, what thought, what predilection, what strange conversation. There's no game plan. And that's also, this is like the worst kind of, business talk. It's like, no business plan, no money, play.
Sorry, it's just, could you also talk about the resentment feeling, please?
Sorry?
Thank you so much for that. Could you also talk about the discontentment feeling?
The discontentment?
Yeah.
Well, I would suggest the only thing to do then is to just keep making more work.
Yeah.
And use the discontentment, because it will be useful. One of the things about making film is, one of the disciplines you have to learn when shooting film is you have to let things go. Mm-hmm. Because you shoot something and then you have to move on. You can't just stay in one spot doing take after take after take. There's this amazing Zen moment when, and this is where the trust comes. And if you're, the director, this is a director's moment, says, we got it, I want to move on. And whatever you feel about it, whether you're a costume designer or a production designer or camera person or whatever, or a performer, you have to go, gulp, I trust you, let's move on. And you just have to have faith that it serves. So I think dissatisfaction, that's the devil. Dissatisfaction will gnaw at you, and don't let it. Don't let it. Use it. Just go, okay, well, I just won't repeat that mistake. You'll make others, but you won't repeat the same ones. Just keep going on, going.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Tilda. Thank
Hi
you
there.
for your amazing work. So I'll have a quick question. What is like an example of a creative challenge you've had that you solved in an unexpected way? And what is your general advice for creative challenges for us artists?
Wow. I mean, one of those questions I wish you'd asked me a week ago and I would have had a better answer. But I would say off the top of my head, in terms of filmmaking, another great challenge, of course, well, it's related to the challenge I just described, is time. Making friends with the chaos, which is the first line of my Notes of Radical Living. Make friends with chaos. Draw on your colleagues. And keep going forward. And acknowledge, if you're out of ideas, acknowledge it and ask for help. And just don't sweat it. Because the other thing is that work, when one's making work, one's not necessarily in charge of the resonance of the work. Very often we make stuff and we look back at it and go, wow, that really, really operates, but you didn't feel it at the time. So you have to trust that as well. You have to trust that you aren't necessarily the best judge of your work. And again, just keep moving forward and just don't be tough on yourself. Be kind to yourself.
Thank you.
Hello, Tilda. My name is Joop Koning. I want to ask you the next question. In the video, The Stars Are Out Tonight, you did a beautiful collaboration with David Bowie. And after this magic video, didn't you have the wish to collaborate with him in a movie?
Well, I can tell you, well, of course. Of course. I had a wonderful, ongoing sort of pen palship with Bowie. We spoke to each other quite a lot, and I have a huge archive of very funny emails, and a couple of strange ideas in there that he was noodling around with quite late on, but I never really took it seriously. I felt so blessed by his friendship, and he was such an early encouragement for me. I mean, I've told this story before, but I was given some Christmas money when I was 12, and I spent it on a copy of Aladdin Sane because of the cover, because he looked like me, and I didn't have a record player. I didn't play it for about a year. I didn't know what it sounded like. It was not the sound, but the vision. He felt really like a cousin. And when I met him, we felt the same about each other. And he was a very, well, I, again, not exactly learned from him, but was deeply encouraged by his beginner's mind. He was endlessly playful and always looking forward. And I can tell you that not that long before he died, he wrote to me and he said, the music, there's so much music. He was always, always looking forward. And he would have been in this show. He is in this show, let's say that.
Let's say that,
yeah,
yeah,
we brought him into the
because
show.
you were both same-minded, so I thought a collaboration in a movie would be great, of course.
Yes, well, let's just fantasize about that movie.
Okay, that's good.
Let's just see it in our mind's eye.
And
It's
can I ask you
great.
something for later? I have a shirt with
From Lowe.
with all the most collaborators with Bowie, and I would like you to sign it later.
I would be honoured.
Yeah?
I would be greatly honoured.
Okay.
Thank you,
very
Jochen.
much. Thank you.
Hi, Tilda. Sorry, over here.
Hi there.
Hi, my name is Therese. I'm actually a student from Edinburgh, so it's nice to hear about hometown. My question is about Derek Jarman. I'm writing my thesis about him and about the literature of the AIDS crisis, but I'm especially interested in creation in a time of emergency and what that looked like, not just for the people who were at the centre of the emergency, but the people who were around them, queer women, collaborators, health workers. And I know it's quite a personal question, but I was wondering, what was it like to create while there was so much loss in the world? And also, on a lighter note, I am going to shoot my shot while everyone else is. I work for the Edinburgh International University Film Festival, and I know your roots are in Scotland, and we'd always love to have you as a judge. But mainly my question is about Derek Jarman.
Well, we'll talk later about Edinburgh, but good for the question. Yes, it's something that I think about a lot more now than I had for a while. It was such a moment in the 80s when I talked about it in our performance that we made with Olivier. I would say it was around about 1986 when suddenly we started hearing of people dying. We had a friend in America, Howard, who suddenly died. I think he was no older than 36. We thought that's a bit strange. People don't die in their 30s. And then over the next couple of years, more and more people got very, very, very mysteriously ill and started dying. And then this hysteria started kind of rolling in. And the way in which the government started behaving was, of course, not helpful and extremely divisive and very frightening for people. And we were all caught up in it because we were all potentially infected and we were all frightened for each other and for ourselves. But the thing about that kind of crisis is it's sort of designed to divide people. And what we knew how to do was to stick together. And when Derek made it known that he was HIV positive in, I think, 1988, 1989, it was a particular moment. People were losing their houses, their jobs, their insurance. The government, UK government, was talking about sort of leper colonies, offshore islands of people who were infected. And he stood up and said, I'm HIV positive, and I'm going to keep going. And that was such a gesture of solidarity, and it sort of broke the spell of isolation. Because, of course, also at that time, people were estranged from their families. Some people who weren't even out were estranged from their families and were really, really isolated and alone. But I look at that. I look at what we learned at that time. We did learn that the power of sticking together through thick and thin, and we're back in a different kind of crisis. It is possible for people to feel super isolated right now for many different reasons. And again, I would suggest, best thing to do, reach out, stay connected, don't get cut off from the herd, because that way madness lies. And so I think we learned that then. I'm very, very grateful to have learned it then. I mean, at a price. And there are many of us who, I mean, some of us, we had a beautiful party on Saturday night for the opening of the show, and there were several survivors there. There are lots of people who weren't because they didn't make it, but we're still around, and we know what that is. And we can attest to the power of that. So we just have to stay connected, whatever anybody tries to do to divide us.
And I think with these beautiful words, we have to end this show because there are already people queuing up for the Eternal Daughter. Thank you very much. Maybe you want to still say something, or?
I want to say thank you to you, Anna. This is Anna Abrams, who runs the film program here, and she is a goddess. we've had such fun, not only putting together a list of films that I can live with, but also marrying them with works from the archive, which has been a dream, putting together these films from the 80s, 90s, 2000s with things from, I mean, we showed a film earlier today from 1899 to go together with Julia, which was a real thrill for me. I mean, I'm a cine nerd, so I'm very happy here.
Thank you so much.